They were told American soldiers were animals, that when the Reich collapsed, women like them, the ones who had served in German officers' quarters, cooked their meals, washed their uniforms, would face the worst kind of vengeance. But when over 200 German women stepped through the gates of Camp Lee, Virginia, in May 1945, a colonel stood waiting with four simple words that shattered everything they believed. No one will touch you here. They expected brutality. Instead, they were given safety, and that protection would prove more unsettling than any punishment. If you enjoy stories of humanity during wartime, consider liking and subscribing for more World War II history. The spring of 1945 brought an unusual cargo to American shores. While victory celebrations erupted across Allied cities and soldiers prepared for homecoming parades, a different kind of transport was quietly arriving at eastern ports. These were not prisoners of war in the traditional sense. They were German women who had worked in Wehrmacht service units. Comfort women, as some documents coldly labeled them, though their duties ranged from cooking and cleaning to secretarial work, and occasionally far worse. The women who stepped off the transport ship SS Marine Raven in Norfolk, Virginia, on May 12, 1945, ranged in age from 19 to 37. They wore a mixture of civilian clothes and faded Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms. Some clutched small bags containing everything they owned. Others had nothing at all. The spring air was humid and warm, so different from the cold German ports they had left behind. The smell of salt water mixed with diesel fuel. American voices shouted commands in English they could not understand. Their hands trembled as military police guided them toward waiting trucks. The sound of their boots on the wooden dock was drowned out by the calls of seabirds and the rumble of engines. Around them, American soldiers loaded crates and checked manifests, barely glancing their way. The women expected jeers, spitting, hatred. Instead, there was only efficiency. Orders barked, but not at them. Forms filled out, but without anger. It was deeply unsettling. The convoy of trucks rolled south through Virginia countryside. The women sat in the covered truck beds, silent, watching America pass by through the canvas gaps. Green fields stretched to the horizon. Farmhouses stood intact, paint fresh, windows whole. Children played in yards. Men drove tractors through plowed earth. There were no bomb craters, no skeletal buildings, no refugees trudging along roadways. The contrast to Germany, where every city was a graveyard of brick and ash, was staggering. Maria Kohler, a former cook from Munich, whispered to the woman beside her, "Where are the ruins? Where is the hunger?" The other woman, Greta Schneider from Berlin, could only shake her head. Her last memory of home was of children digging through rubble for scraps, of families living in basements because the floors above no longer existed. Here in America, life continued as if war were a distant rumor. When the trucks finally stopped and the canvas was pulled back, the women found themselves facing Camp Lee, a vast military installation that sprawled across hundreds of acres. Guard towers stood at intervals, but the overall impression was of order rather than oppression. Neat rows of barracks lined gravel roads. American flags snapped in the breeze. Soldiers walked between buildings with purpose, but without urgency. As they climbed down from the trucks, legs stiff from the journey, the women huddled together instinctively. This was the moment they had dreaded since capture. This was where the Americans would show their true nature. Greta gripped Maria's arm so tightly it left marks. Another woman began to pray under her breath, rosary beads clicking between her fingers. Then he appeared. Colonel James Harrison, commander of the detention facility, walked toward them with measured steps. He was a tall man, perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and a face that had seen too much war. He stopped a respectful distance away and spoke in clear, slow English. An interpreter translated his words into German. "You are under the protection of the United States Army. No one will touch you here. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You have my word." The women stared at him in confusion. Protection? From whom? They were the enemy. They had served the regime that killed American sons. What kind of trick was this? The processing building was a long wooden structure that smelled of fresh paint and disinfectant. The women filed in, still silent, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Inside, American clerks, both men and women, sat behind desks with typewriters and forms. The women were directed to sit and wait their turn. Maria watched as the woman ahead of her was called forward. The clerk, a young American woman in a Women's Army Corps uniform, asked questions through an interpreter. Name, age, place of birth, occupation in Germany. Simple questions asked without malice. The German woman answered in a trembling voice, waiting for the trap. It never came. After 10 minutes of paperwork, she was given a number, a blanket, and directions to a barracks. When Maria's turn came, she could barely speak. The whack clerk looked up from her typewriter and offered something Maria had not expected. A slight smile. Not friendly exactly, but not cruel either. Professional. Human. "Name?" the interpreter asked. Maria gave it. "Age?" 26. "Where are you from?" "Munich." The questions continued. Did she have any medical conditions? Was she injured? Did she need immediate care? The last question caught her off guard. Has anyone harmed you since your capture? Maria looked at the interpreter, confused. Harmed? She thought of the transport across the Atlantic, cramped but with food provided. She thought of the soldiers who had herded them onto trucks, rough but not violent. She shook her head. The clerk made a note and said something in English. The interpreter translated. If anyone does, you report it immediately. We have a duty to protect you. Maria stood there, paper number in hand, trying to process this. Protection. The word kept echoing. In Germany, protection meant something earned through loyalty or family connections. Here it was being offered to enemy women by the very army that had destroyed their nation. It made no sense. The barracks assigned to the German women were separate from the main prisoner of war compound, where captured German soldiers were held. This was intentional. Colonel Harrison had insisted on it during planning. The women's area was enclosed by a single fence, not the double-fenced corridors of the main camp. Guard stations were positioned at entrances, but the guards' orders were specific and unusual. Sergeant William Tucker, a 32-year-old military policeman from Ohio, received those orders directly from the colonel on his first day of assignment. He remembered them word for word because they were unlike any he had received in 3 years of military service. Your primary duty is to keep people out, not in. No soldier enters this area without written authorization. No exceptions regardless of rank. These women are to be protected from harassment, assault, or any unwanted contact. Anyone who violates this directive will face court-martial. Is that clear? It was clear. It was also controversial. Tucker heard the grumbling among some of the men. Why should German women get special treatment? Some of these guys had buddies who died at Normandy, in the Ardennes, at Aachen. Now they were supposed to play bodyguard for enemy women? It didn't sit right with everyone. But Colonel Harrison was not a man who explained himself unnecessarily. He simply enforced the rules. And Tucker, whatever his personal feelings, was a soldier who followed orders. So when Private Davis, a young hothead from Texas, tried to enter the women's area, claiming he needed to inspect something, Tucker stopped him at the gate. Sorry, Davis. No authorization, no entry. Davis protested. He had friends in there, he claimed. He just wanted to look around. Tucker shook his head. Colonel's orders. No one goes in without papers. Davis called him a few choice names and stalked off. 3 days later, Davis tried again, this time attempting to slip past when Tucker was checking a delivery truck. Tucker caught him and this time reported it. Davis spent 2 weeks in the stockade. Word spread quickly. The women's compound was off limits. Really off limits. Not the kind of rule you could bend or ignore. The colonel meant it. And slowly the grumbling faded. Not because soldiers suddenly sympathized with German women, but because the consequences were real and immediate. That first evening in Camp Lee, the women were directed to the mess hall for dinner. They walked as a group, still uncertain, still waiting for the moment when American hospitality would reveal itself as a cruel joke. The mess hall was a long building with rows of tables and a serving line. The smell hit them as they entered. Meat cooking, bread baking, coffee brewing. Real food smells. Not the thin gruel and sawdust bread of the final months in Germany. They lined up given trays and utensils. American cooks served them the same food given to the camp's staff. Mashed potatoes, green beans, sliced beef, fresh bread, butter, and coffee. Maria stared at her tray as if it might vanish. She had not seen this much food on one plate since before the war. Beside her, Greta stood frozen, tears already forming. This cannot be real, she whispered in German. This is a test. They sat at tables assigned to them, separate from the American staff, but in the same hall. The first bites were hesitant. Some women ate slowly, savoring every mouthful. Others ate quickly, as if afraid it would be taken away. Maria forced herself to eat slowly, even though her stomach screamed for more. She watched the Americans at nearby tables, laughing, talking, eating the same food casually as if abundance were normal, because for them it was. One of the older women, Frau Hoffmann, a widow who had worked as a laundress for Wehrmacht officers, began to sob quietly. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming collision of past and present. For 3 years she had lived on scraps. Her husband had died on the Eastern Front. Her sons were missing. She had eaten potato peels boiled in water and called it soup, and now in the enemy's camp she was given meat and butter. The injustice of it, not the cruelty but the kindness, broke something in her. A young WAC officer noticed Frau Hoffmann's tears and approached with a translator. Is she okay? Does she need medical attention? The translator asked Frau Hoffmann in German. The old woman shook her head, unable to speak. How could she explain that she was crying because the enemy was feeding her better than her own country ever had? After the meal, as they walked back to the barracks in the fading light, the women were quiet. Not the frightened silence of the morning, but a contemplative one. They had been told Americans were devils. They had prepared for torture, starvation, humiliation. Instead, they had been given safety, paperwork, and dinner. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Something did not fit. And that night, lying on clean cots with full stomachs for the first time in months, many of them lay awake trying to understand. The days at Camp Lee fell into a rhythm that was both comforting and deeply strange. The women woke at 6 to a bell, not a harsh alarm, but a simple signal. Breakfast was served at 7, then came work assignments. Unlike male prisoners of war who were often put to hard labor in fields or factories, the women's duties were lighter, almost domestic. Some worked in the camp laundry, others in the kitchens helping prepare meals, some in administrative buildings doing basic cleaning. The work was real but not backbreaking. Maria was assigned to the officers' mess kitchen. It was strange, she thought, how history repeated itself. In Germany, she had cooked for Wehrmacht officers. Now she cooked for American ones. The difference was in how she was treated. In Germany, she had been essentially invisible, expected to serve silently and retreat. Here, the American cooks acknowledged her presence. They didn't speak German and she didn't speak English, but they found ways to communicate. Hand signals for more potatoes or stir this. A nod of thanks when she finished a task. One of the American cooks, a middle-aged corporal named Betty from Iowa, even smiled at her occasionally. It was not friendship. They could not speak to each other beyond basic gestures, but it was acknowledgement. Maria existed as a person, not just a pair of hands. It was more than she had received for many of her own countrymen. The women were paid for their work in camp script, small amounts that could be used at the canteen. The canteen itself was another revelation. Shelves stocked with soap, toothpaste, chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper, and pencils. Not abundance by American civilian standards, but incredible wealth compared to the scarcity of wartime Germany. With her first week's wages, Maria bought a bar of soap and a chocolate bar. She held them in her hands that evening, turning them over, still half convinced they would disappear. Greta, who worked in the camp laundry, spent her wages on writing paper. She wanted to write to her family in Berlin, though she had no idea if they were alive or if letters would reach them. The camp allowed prisoners to send and receive mail, subject to censorship. It was a basic right under the Geneva Convention, but after years of Nazi control, where mail was monitored for defeatism and letters could get you arrested, the idea of writing freely felt dangerous. Still, she wrote. She told her mother, if she was alive to read it, that she was safe, that she was being fed, that the Americans, impossible as it seemed, were not monsters. She did not know if censors would cut those lines. She sealed the letter and handed it to the camp postal clerk, a young corporal who processed it without comment. 2 months later, a reply came. Her mother was alive. The house was gone, but she survived. And she wept with relief to know her daughter was safe, even in enemy hands. Sergeant Tucker came to understand his role more clearly as the weeks passed. He was not just guarding the women to keep them from escaping, though that was technically part of his duty. He was guarding them from his own side. The fence and his presence were as much about keeping soldiers out as keeping prisoners in, and that reality played out more than once. Late one evening, 3 soldiers from a different unit, men who had just returned from Europe, arrived at the women's compound gate drunk and aggressive. They had heard there were German women here. They wanted to settle scores, they said. Their friends had died because of Germany. They deserved something back. Tucker stepped in front of the gate, hand on his sidearm. "Gate's closed. Move along." The lead soldier, a corporal with a combat infantryman's badge, stepped closer. "We just want to look around, Sarge. Maybe have a word with these Krauts. Let them know what we think of their Nazi boyfriends." Tucker did not move. "I said move along. These women are under protection. You want to file a complaint? Take it to the colonel, but you're not coming through this gate." The corporal sized Tucker up. He was bigger than Tucker, younger, probably tougher in a straight fight. But Tucker had something he didn't. Orders backed by a colonel who didn't bluff. The corporal cursed, spat on the ground, and turned away. His buddies followed, muttering threats that amounted to nothing. Tucker watched them go, his heart pounding. He didn't tell the women what had almost happened. They slept safely that night, never knowing how close danger had come. It happened again a few weeks later. This time it was a sergeant from Supply who claimed he needed to inspect the barracks for contraband. Tucker checked his authorization papers. They were fake, poorly forged. Tucker confiscated them and escorted the man to the colonel's office. The sergeant was reduced in rank and transferred. The message was clear. Colonel Harrison did not make empty threats. The women began to notice patterns. They saw how Tucker stood at the gate, how he turned soldiers away, how he checked every delivery truck personally. They didn't know his name, but they knew his silhouette. The tall American who stood between them and whatever might come. It was Greta who finally worked up the courage to speak to him through an interpreter one day. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why protect us?" Tucker looked at her for a long moment. The interpreter waited. Finally he said, "Because Colonel Harrison ordered it." The interpreter translated. Greta waited for more, but that was all. Tucker was not a philosopher. He was a soldier. He followed orders. But in that simple answer was something Greta had not seen in years. The rule of law applied equally, even to enemies. It was a concept the Nazi regime had destroyed in Germany. Here, in an American prison camp, it was alive. The letters from home continued to arrive, each one a knife through the heart. While Maria ate 3 meals a day in Camp Lee, her sister wrote of boiling grass to make soup. While Greta slept in a heated barracks with a real mattress, her mother described sleeping in a cellar among rats because the apartment above was rubble. While Frau Hoffmann received medical care for an infected cut from the camp doctor, her cousin in Hamburg wrote of people dying from untreated wounds because there were no doctors, no medicine, no bandages. The guilt was crushing. They were alive, healthy, gaining weight. At night they lay awake listening to each other cry. Some wanted to refuse the food, to starve in solidarity with those back home. But hunger won out. The body, once starved, does not easily refuse sustenance. They ate, and they hated themselves for it. They slept in warm beds, and they despised their own comfort. They were healing, and they felt like traitors. One evening a new woman arrived at the camp. Her name was Elsa Braun, no relation to Eva Braun, though the name made some of the women nervous. Elsa had worked as a typist in a Wehrmacht headquarters in France. She was thin, haunted, and angry. Her first night she refused dinner. "I will not eat the enemy's food," she declared in German. "I will not betray my country." The other women said nothing. They had all felt that way once. By the third day, Elsa's resolve was weakening. By the fifth, she was eating. Not because she had changed her mind about betrayal, but because her body demanded it. Afterwards, she sat in the barracks and wept. Frau Hoffmann sat beside her and spoke quietly. "We are not traitors. We are survivors. There is a difference." But was there? The question haunted them. In Germany, they had been taught that survival without honor was worthless. That sacrifice for the fatherland was the highest virtue. Yet the fatherland had collapsed, the honor had been a lie, and here they were, kept alive by those they had been told to hate. The Reich had demanded their loyalty and offered them nothing but ruin. America demanded nothing and offered them 3 meals a day. The contradiction was unbearable. Some clung to the old ideology out of desperation. If they admitted Germany had been wrong, then what had it all been for? What had their husbands, brothers, fathers died for? Better to believe the Americans were simply clever, that this treatment was psychological warfare, that underneath they were still the enemy. But that belief grew harder to maintain with each passing day. Maria's transformation began with a simple observation. She was in the kitchen, peeling potatoes alongside an American whack cook named Sarah. They couldn't speak each other's language, but they worked side by side in relative silence. The radio was playing American music, something jazzy and upbeat. Sarah hummed along. It was such a normal moment, so ordinary, that Maria felt something inside her chest crack. She had been taught that Americans were uncultured barbarians, that they had no real civilization, only wealth stolen from others. Yet here was Sarah, humming to music, doing her job with quiet competence, treating Maria with basic decency. She was not a devil. She was not a monster. She was just a woman, perhaps a few years younger than Maria, doing her part in a war she probably didn't fully understand either. If Sarah was human, if these Americans who guarded them, fed them, protected them were human, then what did that make the propaganda? What did that make the war? Maria had stood in crowds listening to speeches about racial superiority, about the inevitable German victory, about the subhuman nature of their enemies. She had believed it because everyone around her believed it, because questioning it was dangerous, because it was easier to go along. But now, with a potato peeler in her hand and American jazz on the radio, the lies were impossible to ignore. She thought of the young German soldiers who had stayed at the boarding house where she worked in Munich. They had been so certain, so confident of victory. Where were they now? Dead in the snow in Russia? Dead on the beaches of Normandy? Dead in the ruins of Berlin? And for what? That night she wrote a letter to her sister. The camp censor would read it, she knew. But she didn't care anymore. She wrote, "I am being treated better here than we were in the final days at home. The Americans feed us, they protect us. They are not what we were told. And if they are not what we were told, then what else was a lie?" Not all the women accepted the new reality easily. In fact, a core group of about 15 women, led by Elsa and another woman named Hilde Schmidt, actively resisted what they saw as American brainwashing. They refused to speak to the guards. They whispered that the others were becoming traitors. They maintained their belief in German superiority, in the righteousness of the cause, in the inevitable resurgence of the Reich. Hilde was particularly fierce. She had been the girlfriend of an SS officer, a fact she wore like a badge of honor. She spoke openly of her contempt for the Americans, called them mongrels and weaklings, insisted that Germany had only lost because of betrayal from within. When other women expressed doubt, Hilde confronted them. "You forget who you are," she would hiss in German. "You forget what they did to our country." Greta, who had been growing increasingly disillusioned with Nazi ideology, finally challenged her one evening in the barracks. "What did they do to our country, Hilde? The Americans? They defeated us in war, but it was our leaders who destroyed us. It was our own government that starved us while the officers ate well. It was our own people who bombed cities across Europe and then acted shocked when bombs came back. Who really destroyed Germany?" The room fell silent. Challenging Nazi orthodoxy, even here, even after defeat, felt dangerous. Hilda's face flushed red. "You traitor! You coward! My Kurt died defending the fatherland while you spit on his memory." Greta stood her ground. "Your Kurt died because madmen sent him to die. And for what? Look at us. We are prisoners fed better by enemies than by our own people. What does that tell you?" Hilda had no answer. She stormed out of the barracks. But the question hung in the air. Other women began to speak, hesitantly at first, then with growing boldness. They talked about the inconsistencies they had noticed, the lies they had been told. They talked about how they had been promised victory until the very end, even as Soviet and American forces closed in on Berlin. They talked about the hunger, the fear, the senseless deaths. Frau Hoffmann, the oldest among them, spoke last. "I believed," she said quietly. "I believed because I had to. Because doubt was treason and treason meant death. But belief without question is not faith. It is obedience. And obedience does not make you right. It only makes you useful to those in power." She looked around the barracks at the younger women. "We were useful. And when we were no longer useful, they left us to starve. The Americans owed us nothing, and they feed us. Think about that." Colonel Harrison believed in rules, discipline, and the Geneva Convention. But he also believed in something more controversial: education. He arranged for a series of lectures to be given to the prisoners, covering topics like democracy, civil rights, and the principles of American government. Attendance was voluntary. At first, almost no one came. The hardliners like Hilda called it propaganda. Even the moderates were suspicious. But curiosity eventually won out. Maria attended the third lecture, partly out of boredom, partly out of genuine interest. The speaker was a professor from the University of Virginia, a man in his 60s who spoke through an interpreter. He talked about the American Constitution, about the separation of powers, about the idea that government existed to serve the people, not the other way around. It was a radical concept for women raised under Nazism, where the state was absolute and the individual existed only to serve the collective. Maria listened, fascinated and disturbed. Could a government really be questioned? Could laws really protect citizens from their own leaders? It seemed naive, almost childish. Yet here was America, a nation that had just won a global war, built on these supposedly naive principles. After the lecture, she approached the interpreter with a question. "If American government is so good, why did you drop bombs on civilians? Why did you kill children in Hamburg and Dresden?" The interpreter translated the question. The professor looked at her with sad, tired eyes. "A fair question," he said. "War is horror. We made terrible choices. We killed civilians. We live with that guilt. But we did not start the war. We did not build death camps. We did not invade our neighbors. We responded to evil. That does not make us perfect, but it does not make us the same." Maria had no response to that. The interpreter handed her a booklet, a translated copy of the American Bill of Rights. She took it back to the barracks and read it that night by lamplight. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, protection from unreasonable search and seizure, the right to a fair trial, rights that existed simply because you were human, not because you were useful to the state. She thought about Germany, where speaking against the government meant arrest, where Jewish neighbors had been dragged from their homes in the night, where trials were show trials and justice was whatever the party said it was. She thought about how they had cheered for that system, or at least accepted it, because it promised security, strength, greatness, and it had delivered ruin. The moment that broke Maria completely came 3 months into her captivity. The camp received a new group of prisoners. These were Wehrmacht soldiers, captured in the final days of the war. They were held in the main POW compound, but the processing brought them briefly past the women's area. Maria, working in the kitchen, saw them through the window. They were thin, defeated, some injured, but they were alive, and they were being treated according to the rules. One of them looked up and made eye contact with her. He was young, maybe 20, with a bandage around his head. For just a moment their eyes met. 2 Germans in enemy hands, both alive when so many were dead. Maria saw in his face the same confusion, the same disorientation she felt. They had been raised to see Americans as devils. They had prepared for torture and death. Instead, they found hospitals, food, and rules. That evening, Maria sat in the common area of the barracks, the booklet about American rights in her hands. Greta sat beside her. They had become friends over the months, bonded by shared confusion and the slow collapse of everything they had believed. "I think," Maria said slowly, "that we were the evil ones." Greta said nothing, waiting. "I think," Maria continued, "that we supported evil. Maybe we did not know. Maybe we did not want to know, but we did. And millions died because of it." Greta nodded slowly. "I know," she whispered. "I have known for weeks. But saying it feels like betrayal. My father believed. My brothers believed. They died believing. If I say it was all a lie, then their deaths were meaningless. Maria looked at her friend. Their deaths were meaningless, she said quietly. But that is not our fault. That is the fault of those who sent them to die for lies. Around them, other women were listening. Some nodded, others looked away, not ready to accept what was being said. Elsa, who had resisted the hardest, sat in the corner with tears running down her face. I hate you, she said, but there was no real anger in her voice, only grief. I hate you because you were right, and I don't want you to be right. The transformation was not sudden, it was not complete. Some women never accepted it. Hilda and a few others clung to their ideology until the end, bitter and angry and alone. But for most, the months at Camp Lee had broken down the walls. Not through cruelty or force, but through the steady, grinding contrast between what they had been promised and what they received. They had expected devils and found humans. They had expected torture and found protection. The most devastating weapon, it turned out, was not violence. It was basic human decency. Because decency forced them to see their captors as people. And once you saw the enemy as people, you had to confront the possibility that maybe, just maybe, you had been on the wrong side all along. The war in Europe ended. The camps slowly began to process prisoners for repatriation. But the women faced a unique problem. There was no Germany to return to. Not really. The country was divided, occupied, in ruins. Some had no homes, no families, no idea where to go. The Americans processed them carefully, trying to determine safe destinations. Some were sent to displaced persons camps in Europe. Others were sponsored by relief organizations. A few, like Maria, received help from American churches willing to sponsor immigrants. Maria chose to stay in America. It was a controversial decision. It felt like abandoning her country. But what country? The Germany she had known was gone. In its place was rubble and occupation and collective shame. She applied through the proper channels, sponsored by a church in Ohio. They helped her find work as a cook. She sent money home when she could, helping her sister rebuild. Greta returned to Germany, to Berlin, to help her mother. The city was divided between Allied zones. She found work with the British occupation, translating and helping with reconstruction efforts. In letters to Maria, she described the devastation. You were right to stay, she wrote. There is nothing here but ghosts and guilt. Maybe in 10 years, 20 years, we can build something better. But not yet. Colonel Harrison retired from the Army in 1947. He never spoke publicly about his decision to protect the German women at Camp Lee. It was not dramatic or newsworthy. It was simply following the rules, he would have said. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, so he provided it. But those who knew him understood it was more than that. He believed that how you treated your enemies said more about you than how you treated your friends. Sergeant Tucker was asked about it years later in an interview for a local newspaper. I was just doing my job, he said. Colonel gave an order. I followed it. But I'll tell you this. Those women were scared. They expected to be hurt, and we didn't hurt them. That's not because we liked Germans. Most of us didn't. It's because we had rules, and the rules applied to everyone. The reporter asked if that was hard, protecting enemy women. Tucker thought about it. Yes, he admitted. But being civilized is supposed to be hard. That's why it matters. Maria lived in Ohio for the rest of her life. She married an American, a widower who worked at a steel mill. She had 2 daughters. She rarely spoke about the war years, but her daughters knew the basics. That she had been brought to America as a prisoner. That she had been treated well. That she had chosen to stay. When her daughters asked why, she gave them a simple answer. Because I learned what a just society looks like, and I wanted to live in one. Greta became a teacher in West Berlin. She taught history and literature. She made sure her students understood what had happened, why it happened, and why it must never happen again. She told them about Camp Lee, about the American colonel who enforced rules even when it was unpopular, about the basic human decency that had saved her life and her sanity. We were the enemy, she would tell them. We had served an evil regime, yet they protected us. Remember that. Remember that civilization is a choice, and it must be chosen every single day. The other women scattered across the world, each carrying their own memories of Camp Lee, of the colonel's promise, of the guards at the gates, of meals they never expected and protection they didn't deserve but received anyway. They carried that knowledge forward, a peculiar burden and gift. In the end, the story of the German women at Camp Lee is not about kindness or forgiveness. It is about something simpler and more powerful. The rule of law. Colonel Harrison did not protect those women because he liked them or forgave them or felt sorry for them. He protected them because the rules said so. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment. The United States Army enforced that standard, even when it was unpopular, even when it was difficult, even when the women themselves expected nothing but hatred. And that commitment to principle, more than any act of kindness, was what broke through the propaganda. Because the Nazi regime had taught them that rules were for the weak, that power made right, that strength determined justice. Camp Lee proved them wrong. The most powerful nation on Earth, at the moment of total victory, chose to follow its own rules. "No one will touch you here," the colonel had said. And he meant it. The women carried that truth with them for the rest of their lives. Some, like Maria, built new lives in America. Others, like Greta, returned to help rebuild Germany. But all of them understood that they had witnessed something rare, a powerful nation restraining itself, following its principles even at great cost, treating enemies as human beings deserving of basic rights. That is the story worth remembering. Not because it makes America perfect, but because it shows what becomes possible when societies choose law over revenge, principle over passion, humanity over hatred. These choices are never easy, but they define what it means to be civilized. And sometimes in the ruins of total war, civilization survives in the most unexpected places. Behind a fence at Camp Lee, in a colonel's orders, in a guard's refusal to look the way. In 4 simple words, no one will touch you here. If you found this story meaningful and want to hear more forgotten stories of World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories matter, and together we can keep them alive.